Thales of Miletus, the first scientist in history. More than 2.5 millennia ago, long before telescopes or laboratories, a man stood on the shores of the Aegean Sea, gazing at the sky reflected in the water. His name was Thales of Miletus. He lived in a world ruled by myth and superstition, where thunder was the voice of Zeus and eclipses were signs of anger from the gods. But Thales dared to ask a new kind of question. What if nature itself could explain its own mysteries? That single question would change the history of human thought. This is the story of how one man's curiosity lit the spark that became science. Thales was born around 624 BC in the bustling coastal city of Miletus, in what is now western Turkey. Miletus was a hub of trade and ideas. Merchants from Egypt, Babylon, and Phoenicia exchanged not only goods but knowledge. Navigation, mathematics, and astronomy were essential to its sailors. Surrounded by such influences, Thales grew up observing patterns in nature, the tides, the stars, the changing seasons. While others offered myths, he searched for patterns that repeat and laws that govern. Many historians consider Miletus the birthplace of Western science and Thales its first citizen. From myth to reason. Before Thales, Greek explanations of the universe came from Homer and Hesiod, who told stories of gods shaping the world. But Thales was different. He believed that the world was knowable. As the philosopher Aristotle later wrote, Thales sought the principle of all things and found it in water. That may sound simple, but in that simplicity lies a revolution. Thales proposed that beneath all matter, the air we breathe, the earth we walk on, the fire we see, there was one underlying substance. He called this arche, the beginning of all things. Water, he believed, was that essence, fluid, ever-changing, but essential to life. It was a metaphor for unity in diversity, a concept that would echo through centuries of science and philosophy. 4 to 5 through observation and experimentation. Thales didn't just speculate, he observed. He noticed that magnets could move iron without touching it, and that amber, when rubbed, attracted straw. He didn't know it, but he was seeing the first clues of magnetism and electricity. According to later accounts by Pliny and Diogenes Laertius, Thales was so fascinated by these phenomena that he believed even inanimate objects might possess a soul. It was a poetic way of saying that motion and energy were inherent to matter. In modern terms, we might say he was the first to imagine that the universe is dynamic, not static or controlled by capricious deities. Phymetry, mathematics, was another field where Thales left his mark. He was among the first Greeks to bring Egyptian geometry back to Greece. Literally geometry, earth measurement. He used similar triangles to measure the height of the pyramids by comparing the length of their shadows to his own. He demonstrated that a circle is divided by its diameter and that angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal. These might sound basic today, but for his time, they were groundbreaking. The first steps toward formal geometry. Euclid himself later included Thales' theorems in his Elements, the foundation of geometry for 2,000 years. The eclipse of 585 BC. One of the most dramatic stories about Thales is the famous solar eclipse. Ancient historians like Herodotus tell us that Thales predicted that the sun would be darkened in the year when the Medes and Lydians were at war. When the eclipse actually happened on May 28, 585 BC, the armies dropped their weapons and made peace, believing it a sign from the heavens. Modern research suggests Thales could not have predicted it precisely. No cycle known then could forecast that event, but perhaps he learned of periodic eclipses from Babylonian records. The truth matters less than the symbol, that humans might read the language of the sky. For the first time, the heavens seemed subject to laws, not whims of gods. That idea would inspire astronomy for millennia. Thales was not only a thinker, but a clever businessman. Aristotle tells a story in his Politics. Thales once used his knowledge of the stars to predict a large olive harvest. He rented all the olive presses in Miletus at a low price during winter, when no one else wanted them, and leased them at a high rate during harvest. He made a fortune, proving that philosophers could succeed in business if they chose. It was not about greed, It was a demonstration that knowledge could predict and shape the future. Some economists even call this story the first example of a futures contract. Centuries before Wall Street, Thales showed that reason could turn into results. Thales and the soul of matter. Aristotle also wrote that Thales believed all things are full of gods. This phrase confused generations of scholars. Did he really believe objects had souls? Most modern historians interpret it metaphorically. Thales was suggesting that motion and change are inherent to matter. In other words, the universe is alive with forces, what we would today call energy. In a sense, this was the birth of physics, the recognition that matter has its own internal principles of motion. Thales did not separate nature from spirit. He saw them as one continuum of life and motion. The legacy of the Milesian school. Thales' influence spread through his students. Anaximander proposed that the infinite, the apeiron, was the source of all things, an attempt to generalize Thales' idea of a single origin. Anaximenes chose air as the fundamental element, believing that condensation and rarefaction produced all matter. Together they formed the Milesian school, the first scientific community in recorded history. Their legacy influenced Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Democritus, and eventually Aristotle and the entire Western tradition. They introduced three pillars of science that we still use today: observation, hypothesis, and rational explanation. In the words of historian Leo Cantor, Thales became the myth of reason itself, a symbol of the moment when humans chose to trust their own minds. 1530–1730. Separating myth from history. Of course, not everything we hear about Thales is true. Much of what we know comes from writers who lived centuries later. Some stories were likely embellished to create a founding hero for philosophy. Recent studies, like Miguel Querejeta's paper on the eclipse of Thales, Cycles and Probabilities, 2013, show that the mathematical tools of his time could not predict that specific eclipse. Yet the legend survives because it captures the essence of science: curiosity and courage to search for order in chaos. Even if Thales did not get every detail right, he taught future generations how to ask the right questions. And in science, asking the right question is often the greatest discovery. When we look at modern science, physics, astronomy, engineering, we can still trace the roots back to Thales. Every time a scientist looks for a single law that governs many phenomena, they echo his search for the arche. When an engineer uses geometry to design a bridge, they replay his shadow measurements of pyramids. And when an astronomer predicts an eclipse down to the second, they fulfill a dream that began with him. Science has grown beyond anything Thales could imagine, yet its spirit remains the same, a belief that the universe is understandable through reason. Thales and human curiosity. Thales represents something universal in human nature, our need to understand. We look at the world and ask why rivers flow, why stars shine, why things fall. From those questions grew the entire edifice of science. In a way, Thales is not just a man from Miletus, he is a mirror of our own curiosity. He taught that knowledge is not a gift from the gods, but a result of observation, reason, and doubt. That lesson is as relevant today as it was in 600 BC. The famous fall into the well. One evening, while walking and staring at the stars, Thales fell into a well. A servant girl laughed and said, "You want to know what is in the heavens, but you cannot see what is before your feet." The story is funny, but it also reveals a truth. Scientists and thinkers often stumble because their eyes are fixed on the infinite. It's a reminder that curiosity always carries risk, and that discovery demands a certain blindness to fear. Why does Thales still matter in the 21st century? Because he proves that science begins with wonder, not certainty. He didn't have instruments, laboratories, or equations, only a mind that refused to accept superstition. In an age when information spreads faster than truth, Thales' example reminds us to think critically, to question authority, and to seek evidence. Every experiment, every hypothesis, every theory traces its lineage back to that moment in Miletus when one man asked why. As the historian Jacob Bronowski once said, science is the acceptance of what works and the rejection of what does not. That requires a most unhuman discipline. Thales was perhaps the first to practice that discipline. So next time you look at the night sky or see your reflection in water, remember Thales of Miletus. He saw the same stars you see today, but he saw them not as divine eyes watching from above. He saw them as lights obeying laws. He believed that even the heavens followed patterns that could be known. That belief that the cosmos has order is the foundation of all science. In a universe still full of mysteries, Thales' message echoes across time. The search for understanding is the noblest journey of all. Thank you for watching Chronicles of Genius. If you enjoyed this story, remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with someone who loves science and history. In our next chapter, we'll explore the extraordinary life of Pythagoras, the man who heard the music of the universe in numbers. Until then, keep wondering, keep learning, and never stop asking why.